Hello everybody, welcome to our channel Wings of Gold. I am Shreyas Bhattacharjee and today we'll be discussing a very interesting topic and one that is quite controversial, and that is the Moplah Rebellion or the Moplah Rebellion or the Moplah Riots or the Moplah Riots or the Moplah Massacre. So what is it actually? Well, in short, it is sort of an uprising by the Moplahs of Malabar region against the British administration and their landlords, which sort of turned violent. But the main point is whether to call it a rebellion, a riot or a massacre, when different people call it through different names. So why even discuss it at all? What is its relevance and significance today? Well, the first reason is that it has just completed its 100-year anniversary. The second reason is that it has been in public debate for a long time now. Like, a lot of different people have different interpretations about it, about the nature of the rebellion, the number of casualties and the nature of crimes. But what we'll be focusing on is not on those details, but rather on the aims and the intentions and what drove the events. And the third reason is that our Guruji of history, science, politics, geopolitics, medical and whatnot has not made a video on this. So we'll try to do that for him. So stay tuned and watch this video till the end to know all about this major event that has just completed its 100-year anniversary. Our story starts in the year of 1766 when Tipu Sultan came riding in his horse and invaded Malabar, and the Janmi or the higher caste Hindu landlords had to run away, and those who didn't or couldn't run away were converted. Now you must be thinking that those were the landlords, right? The feudal lords who were really oppressive. So good riddance. But no, actually it's not quite like that. So before 1766, the system was quite balanced. On the one hand, there were the Janmi, who were mostly higher caste Hindus, were not actually considered to be landowners, but rather were considered to be offices of higher respect and dignity, and they got a fair share of the produce. And on the other hand, there were the peasant class, who were mostly Muslims, or the Moplahs and Anthias, who also got a fair share of the produce. So in a way, equilibrium was maintained, and it was quite peaceful, and there were not much conflicts then. But then in 1766, Tipu Sultan came and kicked away all those Janmis. Now fast forward to 1799. The fourth Anglo-Mysore war has just ended, and Tipu Sultan has been killed, and the British administration take control over the Malabar and adjoining regions of Kerala. And now the Janmis get to come back to their lands. And now what the British do is that they introduce a new tenancy laws where the Janmis get total, complete control over the lands, and like they can do now anything like increase rent, kick out peasants, tenants, and whatever they want. And these laws were to be enforced by the courts and the policemen, and the rents actually do go up to even 80% of the produce. And so this you can count as kind of oppression towards the peasants, so much so that the peasants now cannot even survive, feed their own families. And naturally this leads to conflict and resistance towards the British and their landlords. So right from 1833, small isolated uprisings take place throughout Kerala and Malabar, where the Moplahs or the peasants target British administration, its institutions like police stations, courts, etc., and also the landlords and their bungalows. So these uprisings turn quite violent, but nevertheless they do not become widespread and would be crushed quite easily. So if the previous outbreaks were kind of small and isolated, how come the one in 1921 became so big and widespread? Well, to find the answer, we'll need to go back to 1919. So in 1919, the First World War had just ended and Turkey had to face defeat. And therefore, the Caliph of the Ottoman Caliphate had to give away all his powers, and his position was virtually made redundant, and he was forced to go in exile. And for that, the Khilafat movement was introduced or launched in India by the Ali brothers. And then in 1920, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi decided to incorporate that with his non-cooperation movement. And with the merging of the Khilafat movement with the non-cooperation movement, the Khilafat movement was made into a nationwide movement overnight. And like now every citizen knew about it. So why? Because Gandhiji was of the opinion that all citizens of India, all its people, even Hindus too, should support the Muslims in defending their caliphate and help them in re-establishing a caliphate, an Islamic caliphate. And following that, the Malabar Khilafat Committee was formed, headed by Ali Musliar, who had already risen to prominence in the Lahore conference of the Khilafat movement. Ali Musliar, who would go on to be declared as the first ruler of the Islamic Caliphate of India. But more on that later. So let's get back to what we were talking about, the reason why this 1921 revolt became so big and widespread. So you see, unlike the previous revolts, unlike the previous outbreaks, this one was different. First of all, it was guided by the bigger Khilafat movement, and also it was an organized movement, unlike the previous ones. Here, soldiers who had already fought in the First World War, mostly Muslim, were incorporated into an army who were also armed and also had uniforms. So what happened during the rebellion? What were the events like? Well, public spaces like railway stations, police stations and courts were attacked. British officials were killed. And then Khilafat forces took over the spaces. But they were so good in what they were doing that the British had to actually retreat. And Malabar and its adjoining regions were totally freed of British control, at least for a brief time. And as a consequence of that, Malabar Mosque declared that this Malabar and its adjoining regions were a part of an Islamic caliphate, with Ali Musliar being its Islamic ruler. So after the British were driven out, their attention turned towards the Hindus, for they were believed to be collaborating with the British. So then, and because of that, Hindus had to flee, and those who couldn't flee were tortured and then murdered. Women were raped, and temples were desecrated, and the idols too. This is what Annie Besant said about this. They established the Khilafat Raj, crowned a king, murdered and plundered abundantly, and killed or drove away all Hindus who would not apostatize. Somewhere about 100,000 people were driven from their homes with nothing but the clothes they had on, stripped of everything. And in the midst of all this, Varian Kunnath Kunjamad Haji and the Sithi Koya Thangal, who were also prominent leaders of the movement, proclaimed that those who would involve themselves in looting, vandalizing and other sorts of crimes would face exemplary punishments. But that didn't seem to have any effect whatsoever. The rebellion had begun in August of 1921, and by November the British had formed a special force and were beginning to push back the rebels. And by December, the rebellion was almost crushed. But there was one incident, a very tragic one, which I think is very much worth mentioning here. The incident is called the Wagon Tragedy. So what happened is that 90 prisoners were being taken from Tirur to central prison in Madras Presidency, and they suffocated to death in a closed wagon. So a monument to this can be seen today also in Tirur. After the rebellion was crushed, many rebels, along with the main rebel leaders like Ali Musliar, Varian Kunnath Haji and Sithi Koya Thangal, etc. were sentenced to death. It was estimated that about 3 crore rupees worth of property was destroyed and about 13,000 people were killed, among which at least 10,000 were Hindus. And there is no estimate about the number of sexual crimes, the forceful conversions, the temple and idol desecrations. Well, now let's get on to the more interesting part of the video, and that is INC's and Gandhiji's response to the movement and the mess that it left behind. Well, you must be thinking that INC led by Gandhiji must have condemned the violence and must have withdrawn their support from the movement. Like Gandhiji called off the whole non-cooperation movement after the Chaudi Chora incident, where 22 policemen were burned in a police station. Well, nothing of that sort happened. Initially, the INC even refused to acknowledge the violence and the crimes that happened because of the movement. And when denial was not a possibility anymore, they passed a condemnation motion, which too was opposed by some leaders. So what did Gandhiji say about the uprising? He, in an article published in Young India, said, "Hindus must find out the cause of Moplah fanaticism. Hindus will find that they are not without blame. They have hitherto not cared for the Moplah. They have not treated him as a friend. It is now of no use in becoming angry with the Moplahs or the Mussalmans in general." He also said, "The government has thoroughly exploited the Moplahs' madness. They have punished the entire Moplah community for the madness of a few and have incited the Hindus by exaggerating the facts. Malabar Hindus, like the Moplahs, are an excitable group of people, and the government has incited them against the latter." He also tried to justify the rebellion and the massacre that followed. He said, "The Moplah bravery must command admiration. They are brave, God-fearing people who were fighting for what they considered as religion, and in a manner which they considered religious." Do you know what B.R. Ambedkar said looking at Gandhiji's response? Well, he said that Mr. Gandhi was so much obsessed by the necessity of establishing a Hindu-Muslim unity that he was prepared to make light of the doings of the Moplahs and the Khilafats who were congratulating them. When one of Gandhiji's close compatriots and freedom fighter, Maulana Hazrat Mohani, justified the massacre by saying that this was Islamic jihad, and according to the rules of jihad, those who help the enemy become enemies themselves. Gandhiji defended his friend by saying the following: "The Maulana is not to blame, as he considers the British government as his enemy and would go to any lengths to fight them. Moreover, he also thinks that there is not much truth about the massacre and therefore is not prepared to see the truth. He speaks what is in his heart, and therefore the Maulana is a courageous man." Moreover, Gandhiji is also said to have asked the Hindus to prefer death than to flee the atrocities, because he believed that death shouldn't be feared. Birth and death are facts of life and people should not grieve for death. He also asked the Hindus to love the Moplahs more so when they were coming to harm them. This he thought was a Hindu's dharma. Annie Besant too expressed her discontent at Gandhiji's inaction and his response. She said that, "Did Gandhiji not feel even a little bit of sympathy towards those who lay dead and those who were affected by this uprising?" Please feel free to pause this video right here and go through this whole paragraph. You can also pause the video here and go through what B.R. Ambedkar had to say on the overall uprising. Now let's get back to the question that we posed at the beginning of the video. And of course it will be my own opinion and everybody is free to form their own opinions. Well, now the question was what to call this movement, a rebellion, a massacre, a riot, or what? So I think of course it is a rebellion because the rebels actually dared to oppose the British government. But to go on and call it a freedom struggle, I think that's silly, because the aims and the aspirations that motivated the movement wasn't actually aligned with our freedom struggle. So I think it shouldn't be called a freedom struggle, but yes, it is a rebellion. And what about the massacre part? Well, it did lead to the fleeing of many people, and those who couldn't flee were killed, murdered, raped, and or forcefully converted. So I think it is an ethnocide. So it's kind of a rebellion that just went wrong and turned into an ethnocide. Please feel free to share your opinions down in the comment section. If you stayed up till now, I really thank you, and I invite you to come join us in our journey of exploring our history and rich culture and heritage that we have inherited from our ancestors and this beautiful land of India. And for that, I request you to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon.